Arches, organic shapes, dotted by decorative sculptures. You may think this is Vienna or Prague, but it's actually Riga, the capital city of Latvia, a country with less than 2 million people and far away from Europe's heartland. Riga has such a rich build-out of Art Nouveau architecture thanks to a group of German-born Latvian architects, but more to the city's unprecedented wealth in the early 1900s. Riga was a major port city of Russia and used to have almost 30% of its citizens being Russians, who also had a monopoly on the good-paying jobs. The native Latvians, on the other hand, were treated as second-class citizens. Today, it's the other way around. On the outskirts of Tallinn and Riga, you will see residential towers with mostly Russian-speaking residents. They were basically pushed out of the city centers. Something must have changed drastically during the past 30 years. By all means, the Baltic States are very young. They got independent only in 1991. But the Balts have lived on their land longer than the time the British have lived in today's England, the Germans have lived in today's Germany. With this video, I'd like to take you on my tour in the Baltic States to understand their history and their differences. My trip started from Helsinki, the northernmost capital city in Europe. The city sits on a chain of small peninsulas, so wherever you go, you're not far away from the sea. There's a people-friendly park right in the middle, and when I got there, it was packed with people enjoying the sunshine. Back in the old town, the city looks not much different from Nordic capitals like Stockholm or Copenhagen, but old Helsinki feels more Russian, like the Helsinki Cathedral on Senate Square. I went to this old city market, Vanha Kaupahalli. Vendors in this market are separated into these individual wood stands, so you get to have a little privacy while you walk or eat inside. The hall has a quaint atmosphere, but the things they sell can be a bit wild. If you're interested in Finnish design, take the bus to the Itala Arabia Design Center just outside of the city. Itala and Arabia are Finland's two most cherished brands. The Design Museum displays the history of Finnish ceramic art and glass manufacturing. From the very beginning, they appealed not to kings or queens, but to the common people. So like if they came up with a sophisticated design, they usually make another simple version of it, so everyone can keep one in their homes. Helsinki, the city, was established pretty late and doesn't have a medieval past. If you're interested in what old Finland looked like, I recommend taking the 50-minute bus to the neighboring town of Porvoo. Old Porvoo is quite small, only a few blocks square. I arrived early in the day, so I had the cobblestone streets, the alleys, and squares mostly to myself. It's a picturesque small town that reminds me of the many towns I passed by in America's New England. One interesting thing about the Nordic countries, but especially here in Finland, is that most cities follow a grid layout like in the US. I guess it has to do with land supply being almost limitless, and the cities were built relatively late in the industrial era. Getting from Helsinki to Tallinn is super easy. People hop on this cruise, and the 2-hour trip is just a breeze. It was a Monday, so there were many people in their suits and laptops. Taking a ferry to a business trip thus sounds very cool. Tallinn is a well-preserved medieval city. It was built by the Danish and was later conquered by the Teutonic Order. If you ever wonder how medieval life is like, with city walls, guilds, knights, and things like that, Tallinn may be a better destination than a city in Denmark or Germany. The upper town called Toompea is from where the country Estonia has long been ruled. Here you will find great scenic viewpoints overlooking the city. The lower town was an independent city and a member of the Hanseatic League, a trade union like today's EU that brings trade and wealth to a lot of its members. That explains why you see similar Gothic brick buildings as in Lübeck and Bergen. I had a meal in the famous old Hansa restaurant. I dined by candlelight, had some deer meat and local beer served in a clay mug. The staff did a great job making the dining experience a great one to remember. Overall, Tallinn feels just as Finnish to me as Helsinki. The landscape, the atmosphere, even the people look very much alike. Estonians and Finns share the same ancestor, and both of their languages are agglutinative in nature. Agglutinative means sentences are formed by adding affixes to a root word. For example, table in Finnish is pöytä. My table is pöydäni. On my table is pöydälläni. You just keep appending letters to the end. However, culturally and historically, Estonia has parted away from Finland and moved closer to Latvia since the 12th century. At the time, waves of crusades from Germany, especially the Teutonic Order, conquered and combined what's today Estonia and Latvia into Livonia. Livonia lived on as a political entity well into the 12th century, although Estonians and Latvians had always been managed separately. Estonia and Latvia joined the EU together in 2004. After years of economic integration and migration, the two countries look very similar from a tourist perspective. There are differences like language and architecture, but that may not affect with my overall impression. I arrived in Riga by bus, and right next to the bus station is the Riga Central Market. What's interesting about this market is that Riga bought these gigantic Zeppelin hangars from Germany after the war, and they repurposed them and essentially cover this whole market. This also happens to be Europe's largest covered market if you exclude Istanbul's Grand Bazaar. Remember the Art Nouveau buildings I mentioned? Riga used to be a major industrial city of the Russian Empire. That brought in money, immigration, and ambition. Therefore, some of the buildings in Riga look way oversized compared with the size of the city. The old town is beautiful, but just like Tallinn, once you get out of the city center, you would see tons of Soviet-era residential buildings occupied mostly by people who speak Russian. I would recommend a visit to the Latvian National Library. The facility has a rather stern look, but it tells you a lot about Latvian literatures. Also, who doesn't like a library where you can catch an amazing view of the city, free of charge? We know European city with an old town is nothing new, but Vilnius's old town is really special. I actually prefer it to Tallinn, which is more touristy and Lego-like. Užupis is a self-declared independent state within Vilnius, although it is largely unrecognized. It has its own president, flag, and constitution. It was a pity that I didn't spend much time exploring Užupis since I was on my way to another place. The area is actually quite established, even a bit upper middle class, I would say. That's very different from Freetown Christiania in Copenhagen. There are also some trendy apartments and shops right next to it, so if I were an artist or a filmmaker, this would be where I want to live. Film and art have also been a significant boost to Vilnius' economy in recent years. HBO's Chernobyl was filmed here, Stranger Things Season 4 was filmed here. The main draw are tax incentives, high-level professionals, and part of the city can be easily transformed back into the Soviet era. None of the old cities on the eastern shore of the Baltic were founded by the Balts, but largely by Germans, Poles, and Jews. Vilnius University was once a center of Polish thoughts and letters. Pilsudski, the legendary Polish founding father, was born in Lithuania. It was a solemn experience visiting his tomb on the outskirts of Vilnius. When I visited the Grand Duke's Palace Museum in Vilnius, there were 4 to 5 different students and army groups on guided tours, which is kind of unusual for an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. But it also says about how the Lithuanians treat their history seriously. The palace itself is a good testament to this. The current structure was built on old ruins, and the design was debated and carefully chosen to resemble the original building. The Baltic States all rank high in the happiest countries in the world. And I think that's largely because the Balts are often very quiet and polite, respecting each other's own space. They do share a lot of characteristics in common, but once you understand a bit about the history of each, you would realize that they're still distinctive from each other in different ways. The word Balts refers only to people from Latvia and Lithuania, while Estonians and Finns are Finnic. Estonia and Latvia have been closely related in history, while Lithuania spent most of its time with Poland. There are quite a few interesting stereotypes that the Baltic people have towards their neighbors. The Estonians were considered slow, Latvians are potato farmers, Lithuanians are cocky and hot-blooded. Last but not the least, the Baltic states all had their fair share of Soviet rule. In today's public opinion, Russians are often portrayed as the aggressor and the occupier. But we should be aware that there were, and still are, a large number of ethnic Russians living in the Baltic countries, especially in Estonia and Latvia. Soon after 1991, both Estonian and Latvian citizenship law excluded a vast majority of Russian speakers from voting and other public services. For example, it was calculated that if some of the proposed quota were adopted, it would take over 500 years for all Russians in Latvia to acquire citizenship. The discrimination got pushed back by the EU and the US. Otherwise, we would see a familiar story of how the oppressed eventually became the oppressor. The bad dealing would almost certainly cause problems, as we see in the case of eastern Ukraine. Borders are places where identities take on absurdly definite forms, in barbed wire fences and vigilante patrols. At the same time, they are places where boundaries between different cultures break down. The ethnic Russians living in Estonia and Latvia aren't affected by what's going on in geopolitics and still have their own say at the local level. But I think this balance can also be easily broken if people blindly follow an Estonia for Estonians or Latvia for Latvians mandate. In a divided world, tolerance and acceptance are more important than ever before. That's it for my trip in the Baltic States. Thank you for watching. See you next time.